Welcome to Murder Most Foul, a podcast devoted to exploring famous murder cases of our time. Some solved, some unsolved, but all fascinating and guaranteed to raise the hairs on the back of your neck. I'm your host, Jim Solanowski. Today's episode: A Perfect Storm of Injustice. Imagine you come home from a pickup basketball game at your church's gym to find your wife and two small children slaughtered in your garage. But wait, it gets worse. Now imagine, after a few short days of inept, possibly corrupt investigation, and despite the fact that you have 11 witnesses swearing you were with them at the precise time of the murders, you are arrested for the crime. Not done yet. You are convicted twice, with 2 appeals vacating your previous convictions. 3 times the charm, you say? Join me today as we navigate the 13-year odyssey that is the case of former Indiana State Trooper David Camm and his quest for justice. My guest is former FBI agent and investigator for the defense, Gary Dunn. Producer's note: this edition of Murder Most Foul is just under 2 hours in length. I hope you'll take the time to follow the story to its conclusion. For David Camm. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Murder Most Foul. My guest today is former FBI agent Gary M. Dunn. And he was involved with an incredible case and has written 2 books. And actually, one of them now, if you get the later version, has a synopsis of the first one, which is the full case of a gentleman named David Camm. And I'm not even going to categorize it by the end of this podcast. I think you'll see the injustice that was done to David Camm. So welcome, Gary.
Hey, well, thank you, Jim, and thanks for having me. It gives me yet another opportunity to explain, perhaps, to that many more people just what a horrendous injustice was done to David, but not only to David, but to his family and to the citizens of Floyd County, Indiana, where all this took place. It's an incredible story, and it's a coming together, as Dave has termed it, perfect storm of injustice. First, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So,
yes, start with your background, how you got involved, and I don't think it was the very beginning. Like we're not tipping anything off here. There was 3 trials, so you got involved. I'm not sure if it was the very first one, but you did become involved along the line.
I got involved in David's case 4 years after the horrific murders of his wife Kimberly and son Brad, age 7, and daughter Jill, age 5, which occurred in September of 2000 in Floyd County, Indiana, a suburb of Louisville, Kentucky. At the time, I was still an active agent with the FBI. I'd retired 3 years later in 2003 after 27 years with the FBI, and I was all over the place: Miami, Chicago, New York, Gary, Indiana, Southern Indiana, and had investigated any number of different kinds of crimes, white collar, foreign counterintelligence, and certainly violent crime. And the murders of Kim and Brad and Joe were beyond horrific. Essentially, the 2 children were assassinated, executed in the back seat of the family vehicle in the garage at their home. it's almost incomprehensible how they died at the hands of a very brutal, callous, cold-blooded coward. And we'll talk about him later. But anyway, so 2003, I retired. The next year, after teaching for a year and a half or so, I began conducting private investigations and was contacted by a defense attorney in Bloomington, Indiana. Her name is Catherine Kitty Lyle, and she wanted me to get involved in a voter fraud case that she had. I looked at it, I said, okay, I'll do this, somewhat reluctant, but we found out that her client had been an innocent person who had been falsely charged by a very politicized prosecutor. And we resolved that. The charges were dropped. And then she said, I want you to get involved in another case. And I said, well, what is that? And she said, David Camm. And I go, whoa, I'm thinking to myself, there's no damn way I'm going to get involved in this case. The reason I was reluctant was because I'm originally from Floyd County, Indiana. And although I never followed the case closely, I was certainly aware that David Camm had been convicted in 2002 of the murders of his wife and children. And that David, a former Indiana State Police trooper, his case was investigated by the Indiana State Police. And for the prior 18 years, I had worked very closely with the state police in Northwest Indiana, as well as Bloomington. And I had a marvelous working relationship with them and with any number of really outstanding detectives and others. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to get involved in the case that would put me at odds with these former people. Of course, you know, at least in law enforcement, there's a common term. It says, well, if you work for the defense after being a criminal investigator for whatever agency, you've quote unquote gone to the dark side. And I sure as heck didn't want to go to the dark side. And I told Kate, I said, well, let me think about it. But at the time, I'm thinking there's no way. She says, well, just look at it. I thought, well, okay, so this is in 2004, and this is after the Indiana Court of Appeals had overturned David's first conviction. And when I read the appellate decision, it was shocking to me because they said that were it not for the cheating of the prosecutor, which was facilitated by the judge, that there was a good chance that David would have been found not guilty. And I'm going, well, that's not something I had heard of, you know. And so I looked at it more and more and more. And the more I looked at it, the more I'm thinking, this can't be the same state police that I worked with that was really meticulous and diligent and followed every lead. And it wasn't the same state police. The Sellersburg Post of the Indiana State Police, I wish I could say they did an abysmal job, but that would have been that would be an accolade, quite frankly. It was not abysmal; it was horrifically bad and conducted by an incompetent investigator. And these are just not my assessments or opinions. This is later on as a civil court concluded. But so anyway, I told Kitty, I said, okay, and this is the fall of 2004. I said, I'll let me get involved. Let me look at that. After I wanted more and more information, and so I did get involved, and then we found out from beginning to end, this thing was screwed up by everybody that touched it. And let me start off by laying the groundwork of the crime scene, okay? And a timeline, if you will. The murders occurred after 7:35 p.m. on the evening of Thursday, September 28th, 2000. And we know that time because we have a neighbor seeing Camm's black Bronco pull into the dead-end road where they lived after he started watching Jeopardy that night. And so it was a few minutes after the start of Jeopardy. So it's about 7:35. And we do know that David, at that time, was playing 5-on-5 full court basketball at a church gym about 4 miles away in the family's church, which had an adjoining family life center with a full court gym. And he's there with the other 9 guys who are playing basketball. And also there's an 11th player, that's his uncle, Sam Lockhart. And then later in comes a church elder, a guy by the name of Tom Jolly, and he's watching these guys play ball. So we know that David Camm, and we know that he gets there at 6:59 p.m. because that's when the alarm to the church is disengaged. And we also know that several people are with David at the time. So David's playing basketball at this time. He plays 5-on-5 full court until about 8:10 or 8:15 when he sets out a game and his uncle replaces him. But David sits on the sideline with Tom Jolly and talks about Tom's 2 sons, one of whom is David's age and who they were friends with one another. So David is there. We've got the other 10 players and a spectator talking with him, people guarding him. He's going to the basket, fouling people, getting fouled. So this is where we know he is at the time. Kim and the kids had left Brad's swim practice from 6 to 7 p.m., and that was in New Albany, about a 25 minute ride from the Camm residence in Georgetown. So they leave 7 o'clock, get into their car a few minutes after 7:10 or so. So it fits well the timeline that they get there about 7:35. At 9:22 p.m. is when the alarm is engaged again. And we know that by this time there's 8 remaining players. Dave is one of them. And that all the other 7 say, yeah, we all left at the same time, 9:22. Dave gets into his car, actually his truck, and drives home. And a few minutes there, 4 or 5 minutes, he hits the overhead garage door on his side. It's a 2-bay garage. He sees Camm's black Bronco in the left bay with the door still up. He hits his garage door opener. His door comes up, and he sees the body laying there on the floor of the garage. He initially thought it was Jill, and he jumped out of his truck, ran up to it, and sees it's Kim. And Kim has a very large pool of blood around her head with a blank stare on her face. And David, who had been a 10-year veteran of the Indiana State Police, had responded to any number of fatal accidents, immediately saw that his wife was dead. At that time, overcoming the shock of seeing that, he's thinking, Brad, Jill, where are they? And he looks into the back seat of this 2-door Bronco, and he sees his daughter, who's nearest to him on the passenger side, still strapped in her seatbelt. As she's slumped over, there's what is later determined to be a bullet wound in her head. Someone had, while she was sitting there, had shot her in the head, and she, of course, is dead. Dave recognizes this. Brad is stretched out over the back seat bench as though he's trying to get away from the shot, but he is shot through and through the torso, and the single bullet severs his spinal column. He may have lived for a short period of time, but it was certainly a fatal wound. David doesn't know this. He thinks his son may have a chance to be revived. He gets into the Bronco through the front seat, goes through over the console between the two bucket seats in front, grabs his son and removes him, puts him on the floor of the garage, and begins CPR. It's not working, of course. He's panic-stricken, of course. He then runs across the road to where his grandfather lives, and that's where his Uncle Nelson Lockhart is that night, taking care of Nelson's father, who is, as I noted, David's grandfather, who's in his 90s. And Dave yells and screams at Nelson, "Come quick. My family's been shot. They've been killed." Nelson runs across the gravel road and into the garage and determines that Joe, he searches for a pulse. There is none. Recognizes Kim's dead and recognizes all three are dead. And he tells David, "We need to get out of here. This is a crime scene." Now, sometime between when David ran across the road and Nelson came back over, David also ran into the house and called his former friends at the state police in Sellersburg and tells them, "My family's been killed." He's screaming. It's a horrific phone call. But nonetheless, the state police alerts their units, the Floyd County Sheriff. You got the EMTs coming out there. The first units arrive at 9:42 p.m. And that's when Sean Clemens, who later becomes the lead detective, and another officer arrive. And then subsequent to that, it's the entire neighborhood is lit up with blue and red lights, and it's just a mass of people. Also being summoned to the scene are several Indiana State Police evidence technicians, one of whom is James Niemeyer, who comes from about 60 miles away, but he's the lead evidence technician in the southwest part of Indiana. He covers Floyd County. At that time, a fellow by the name of Sam Sarkison is the evidence tech in the Sellersburg Post. So they all arrive there. There's a wait until a search warrant is obtained for the garage before there's any processing of it. And some people have asked me, was that normal? And the answer is, yeah, it's very normal. And it was sound protocol on the part of the state police. Wait until you get a search warrant, because you never know what may happen later on. You're doing it by the numbers. So they do get a search warrant, and about 1 o'clock in the morning the next day, September 29th, is when they begin processing the scene. But something happens before that scene is ever processed. And the lead technician for the entire southwest portion of the state, he makes a conclusion. He looks in the inside of the garage. He's standing outside, looks inside, and tells another trooper there, "This is David Camm's crime." Now, how in the world he came to that conclusion is beyond me. That's like saying, "Ready, fire, aim." But that conclusion obviously was told to another, and I'm sure that it spread like wildfire, which it did. And so now we have a conclusion that David Camm had murdered his wife and kids, before any evidence is scrutinized, much less collected or tested. So we have this conclusion. We also have the introduction of a gentleman by the name of Stanley Faith. He arrives on the scene about an hour after Dave had called the state police. And Stan Faith is the elected prosecutor in Floyd County. And he is a hardcore politician, first and foremost. A very hard-nosed prosecutor, too. Stan Faith, after leaving the scene, he calls a fellow that had worked with him before by the name of Rod Englert. Rod Englert is this bloodstain expert, and I almost choke on that phrase, at least when it comes to Englert. Rod Englert had helped Stan Faith on a couple previous cases in which Faith was able to resolve them. So Englert is being solicited by Faith to come to Georgetown to put his expertise to work on bloodstain interpretation. And he's also a crime scene reconstructionist, purportedly. So Englert, when he speaks to Faith, several hours after Faith leaves the scene, Englert says, doggone it, I'm at a seminar in, I believe it was Phoenix, but my ace protege, Robert Stites, will come there and will give you a hand. And Faith says, that's great. So Rob Stites arrives the next day. It'd be Saturday, and that would be the 30th of September. And he immediately goes to the Kentucky Medical Examiner's office, been processed and autopsied the day before. And Stites takes all these measurements. He's got a protractor. He's got a dowel rod. He's doing all these expert things. And then he goes to the crime scene and begins his tutorial there at the crime scene for all these police officers who are supposedly in awe of this great expert. And we'll find out about him a little bit more later. But something else happened at the Kentucky Medical Examiner's office the day before when those autopsies had been conducted. Camm's body had 22 abrasions, cuts, bruises all over her body, including abrasions on the top of her feet. Weird. Clearly, she had been in a battle for her life and the lives of her children. The autopsy of Jill had also revealed that she had blunt force trauma to her external genitalia. External, that's important. At that time, the medical examiner opined to Sam Sarkinson, the evidence tech, that it was possible that this child may have been molested. Now, here's where it gets really muddy, and I think the mud is being stirred up by the participants, my view. Sarkinson calls the lead detective, Clemens, from the medical examiner's office and said, Jill's been molested. So now they go back and they get another search warrant for the interior of the house, which they hadn't even searched before. They had just done a screening. And so they go back and they look at the inside of the house, looking for evidence of molestation, thinking that Dave had molested his daughter. And of course, at that time, in view of the fact that they've already made the conclusion that this is David Camm's crime. Now they're convinced that David Camm is a molester. And at that time, any semblance of civility towards David as he's outside the crime scene with the rest of his family has dissipated. He's being treated like a molester and a murderer, okay? So that's what we have leading up to this. So David Camm's crime, he's a molester. And we've got this bloodstained guy coming in here who's going to give us additional evidence that we need to, that's right, charge David Camm. So what happens is that Rob Stites looks at all this evidence, and he looks at a shirt and shorts that David Camm is wearing during that basketball game. Of course, that's what he's wearing when he removes his son from the car and gets blood from his son on his shirt. And Rob Stites focuses on the lower left portion of that shirt of David's, and there's 8 tiny droplets of blood, appears to be blood, and they later do test positive for blood. And he says, aha, this is HVIS. And people are saying, what is HVIS? He goes, well, it's high velocity impact stain. And this happens when a person is within, he says 6 feet. Most people would say, most experts would say within 4 feet of a gunshot wound or blowback. And says, this positively says that David Camm was present when his daughter, or when these murders occurred. Now, it's important to note that, of course, Jill is in the back seat, so it can't be her because she's there, and there you got the side of the car. If someone's shooting at her, and if it's David, the left lower portion of his shirt will be obstructed by the car itself. So Stites thinks it's Kim Camm's head wound because Kim has been shot outside the vehicle through and through the head, and he thinks it's blowback from Kim's head wound. Stites also thinks that he sees blowback on the overhead garage door, and he even thinks he sees the silhouette of the shooter. You can't make this stuff up, but that's what he thinks. So now we've got the coming together of a probable cause affidavit to charge David Camm. What I didn't mention to you is when that scene was processed, that the garage was the only thing processed originally, and as I indicated, later on the house. But over a total of several days, 19 different people, 19 collected evidence from either the garage, the interior of the house, or someplace associated with it. At least 5, maybe 6 of whom had no police experience. And some of the evidence that was collected, we know for a fact, was lost. So you've got 19 different people collecting evidence from a crime scene, including the prosecutor's own investigators, because by now the prosecutor has assumed control of this case, which was one of the biggest derelictions of duty I've ever seen on the part of the state police. That was not the prosecutor's responsibility. They should have said, get the hell out. This is our case. We're going to do it correctly. They didn't. They kowtowed to him. So we've got 19 different people collecting evidence. We've got a guy purported to be an expert, and he's also supposed to be a crime scene reconstructionist, Mr. Stites. And we got all this coming together. And so on Sunday, October 1st, less than 72 hours after the Camm family is slaughtered, we have a probable cause affidavit that reflects, among other things, certain assertions that are simply fabrications. Among other things, the lead detective said that David Camm left the basketball game on or around 9 o'clock. That was not accurate. He didn't leave until 9:22. Sean Clemens, the lead detective, didn't have a clue because the basketball players with whom David had been playing had not even been interviewed by him, and they were not even interviewed in person, most of them. It was over the phone and as after the fact. So he claims that. He also claims that he spoke with a person who said that around 9:15 or later that a person heard three sounds that could be interpreted as gunshots, meaning this would be after Dave had gotten home after leaving at 9 o'clock or so, around 9:15. Well, that person was David Camm's aunt, who lived in the extended driveway beyond him, and she says, "I never said that. That's not accurate." So Clemens had either purposely or stupidly fabricated a piece of evidence that wasn't accurate. And then we have the bloodstain guru, Stites, who says that, among other things, that you've got this blowback on Dave's shirt, but he says also there's evidence of a cleanup at the crime scene with the blood of surrounding Kim's head wound, because the blood had dramatically changed colors from bright red to this serum. And Stites, supposed to be an expert on blood, says that there's been something added, like bleach. He didn't recognize that blood naturally separates. It's a phenomenon that the red blood cells separate from the serum, which is natural. He also says that the cleanup solution had been taken and thrown over the back porch because there were spots on the porch. Well, those spots were the result when Dave had previously high pressure washed, cleaned that deck, that porch. You can't make this stuff up. But nonetheless, and they also say that Joe Camm had been evidence of recent molestation, okay, which was the nail in the coffin. Once you get an allegation of molestation against a person, once it's out there, there's absolutely no way you can put that stench back in the bottle. And to this day, it's not. To this day, it's not. So now you've got all of this information in a probable cause affidavit, which doesn't rise anywhere near probable cause. And they don't even attempt to explain that David Camm is playing basketball, because they say that this crime, this murder, occurs after he got home after 9:15. So they charge him. They make this great, and they arrest him. Dave can't attend the funeral of his wife or children. He's denied bond. But then prosecutor Faith recognizes he's got a real problem, because it finally dawns on him that maybe this expert ain't, because this serum separation had to have occurred probably at least an hour before David supposedly murdered them after 9:15. And so what does he do now? It's like, see, can I go back before the entire metro Louisville area and say, when I said that David Camm had murdered his wife and kids, that really, maybe it's not true. We'll get back to you on this. No, he changes his time, doesn't tell anybody, changes the time of the murders to after 7:35, when this neighbor sees Camm's Bronco pulling into the driveway. well, you think, well, how in the world does that make any sense? Because Dave was playing basketball with 9 others and 2 others present at the time. That he can't be in 2 places at once. Not to fear, because Faith, when it goes to trial, paints all these guys as liars or mistaken, and certainly his uncle, Sam, is a liar because he's trying to cover up for Dave, trying to cover up for the murders of his wife and 2 children. It's like, this is nuts. This is insane. It would be difficult enough for Faith to portray the basketball players as liars, which he did, but it'd be even more difficult for him to say, well, the blood serum separation, it also lied. So he had to go with this. So now he goes with the during the basketball games. And you think, how in the world could he get away with that? And how in the world could the first jury in 2002 convict David Camm? And the answer is very simple. The prosecutor cheated with the facilitation of the judge. Well, how did he cheat? Well, because he alleged 3 motives, none of which had any substance or any evidence to support them. The first was that David had molested his daughter, and he killed him to cover it up. Does that make any sense? So, David Camm, a 10-year cop, is going to kill his daughter to hide up the molestation, but yet he knows that her body will be autopsied and the molestation will be determined. That doesn't make any sense, but that's what he says. Secondly, he says because of Kim was had a hefty life insurance on herself, and the fact that she did, but Kim was also in the insurance business, working for a large insurance corporation in Louisville as an accountant, and she saw fit to have not only a large policy and policies on herself, but also in a couple months before that had gotten sizable increases on Dave in case anything ever happened to him. Kim was obviously college educated and very smart. And then the third motive, according to Faith, was that Dave did this because he wanted to kill his wife so he could be a philanderer without being encumbered by his wife and kids. The fact of the matter is that David had engaged in adulterous affairs in the past. No denying that. But what Faith told the first judge, unbeknownst to Mike McDaniel, David's defense attorney at the time, was that he was going to tie these affairs in with the motivation behind killing Kim. And so he brings in, and the judge allows him to bring in 8 or 10 women, many of whom David had made flirtatious comments to, certainly not all of them with whom he had affairs, but some with whom he did. And so they come in and here you got a guy on trial for his life, and the jury hears that previously that he's had affairs. They hear this allegation of molestation without any evidence, and there's insurance involved. By the time the defense had an opportunity to present their defense in the first trial, Dave was toast. The jury hated him, and understandably so, if you would have been told that as well. So that's what happens, and Dave gets convicted, 3 counts of murder, and gets sentenced to 65 years each, 195 years, and he's shipped off to the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, which is the maximum security prison in Indiana. It's 150 years old. It's archaic. It's about as depressing as it gets, having been there myself several times. So in 2004, the appellate court does hear the appeal, which was written by Kitty Lyle and Stacy Juliana and says, "You're right. These affairs, there's no way they should have been brought in as evidence. And if they hadn't been, there's a chance that they would have been acquitted." So now we have 2004. This is when I get involved. And this is when another prosecutor who had defeated Faith in a general election, he also gets involved. And this fellow's name is Keith Henderson. Keith Henderson is a very aggressive prosecutor. He's very active in the Indiana Prosecuting Attorney Council, which is a major player in Indiana politics. They have a great deal of influence. Prosecutors in Indiana essentially are untouchable. Keith Henderson's a major player there, and as a matter of fact, he is the chairman of the Ethics Committee, which when you find out of what...
And we'll find out something a little later why that is just hysterical, and we will talk. Yeah. We'll reference back to that concept that he's on the ethics. Yeah, which is
more irony. But so what Henderson does, he says upon receipt of the fact that there's going to be a retrial if he pursues it, he says he wants to have a fresh eyes look at this case. And so he appoints two fellows primarily, one of whom is Wayne Kassinger, a retired Louisville Metro police officer, and the other is Gary Gilbert, who is a Indiana State Police detective out of the Evansville Post. So those two primarily are the ones who reinvestigate this crime and to see if there's enough evidence to recharge David. Now, later on, we're going to find out that that's not, according to Kassinger. He said all they wanted to do is look to see that, they could charge him again, and they weren't really looking for any new evidence. And that was obvious. So what happens is that we, this is when I get involved, and this is when we start looking at a lot of things, including things that have been either overlooked or apparently have been tested and no results. One of which is a garment which is found on the garage floor, which is a gray sweatshirt, extra large sweatshirt. Now, this sweatshirt, which is found on the garage floor, doesn't belong to anybody. In the first trial, Faith tried to say it belonged to David, but it didn't. And so in the first trial, Mike McDaniel, the defense attorney, had it tested. And lo and behold, he finds out that there's unidentified male DNA on this sweatshirt. The sweatshirt also contains the blood of Camm on one of the sleeves and also on the front. And so clearly this has been worn by someone, apparently the deduction would be, that it had attacked Camm. So we get this unidentified male DNA that Mike McDaniel has obtained from this outside lab, and he asked Stan Faith to run it through CODIS, the National DNA Database. Faith, a couple weeks later, says, we ran it through and there were no matches. That was a lie. That was a blatant lie, because later on we find out, shortly after, in early 2005, when Kitty is adamant with Henderson, run this or I'm going to get a court order, demand. And so he finally does. And this DNA comes back to a fellow by the name of Charles Darnell Bonet. Bonet is a New Albany native who lived within a couple blocks of a butcher shop where Camm's sister and brother-in-law owned and operated it, and where Camm and the kids had visited quite often, and where Bonet had also visited. There's no doubt in my mind that he had seen Camm at this store. Charles Bonet. So what happens with him? Well, unbeknownst to us at the time, before we're told of this match, he's interviewed by Wilkerson and not Wilkerson. He's interviewed by Gary Gilbert and by Kessinger, and it's like interviews which just I was just aghast. Kessinger's giving him answers, supposedly for a man who's this super investigator. He's given Bonet answers like, "Well, is it possible that you gave this wrapped a gun in this sweatshirt? Is it possible that you did this or that?" And it's like Bonet's going, "Oh yeah, that's possible. Yeah, sure." Well, what I need to tell you is Bonet's background. He has been in and out of prison for many years. Most recent which occurred at Bloomington, Indiana, on the Indiana University campus, where he had committed a home invasion. There were 3 IU co-eds present, and he had taken his mother's .38 snub-nosed revolver and stuck it to the back of this one co-ed, threatening to blow her brains out, her effing brains out. And he took them around the interior of their townhome, took their money, and then took them outside into one of the vehicles and was going to abduct them. Fortunately, a neighbor had seen what was going on, had summoned the Bloomington police, and they arrested Bonet at gunpoint. And this turns out that this was his most recent armed robbery. The week before, he had entered the office of an apartment building and had stolen several $100s there. Prior to that, however, he had also, when he was a student at IU in 1987-88, he had attacked several co-eds, tackled them, and then had stolen a shoe from them. And you think, well, this is strange. Well, yeah, but what I didn't tell you yet is at the crime scene in the garage, sitting on top of the black Bronco, were Camm's 2 brown shoes, placed very neatly there. Someone had ensured that they were being treated, apparently, with some kind of reverence. Charles Bonet was a shoe freak, and I had subsequently found previous girlfriends of his who told me that he would get off sexually over shoes. I don't think there's any doubt that Camm was the target, the sexual target of Charles Bonet. Certainly, her shoes were a target. And this all comes together, and we're thinking, praise God, we found the guy. David's going to be exonerated. He is exonerated. He's going to be released, and we'll get this nightmare over. Why aren't you folks listening to reason? Where's the logic that you're missing? What happens, though, is that I was able to find Bonet's wife. He's married at this time. And I reach out to her and I say, hey, can you get a word to your husband? I'd like to talk to him. And so he calls me. And Charles Bonet is, he thinks he's a master manipulator. He clearly is a antisocial personality type, sociopath, psychopath, whatever you want to call him. But he agrees to meet with me. And I get about a 2.5, 3 hour interview with him. Among other things, the first 10, 15 minutes, he lies about 10, 12 times to me. Clearly, I expected this. But during this interview, I'm asking him, So you're telling me that your sweatshirt that was found at the crime scene, you gave it away to the Salvation Army? Yeah, that's what happened. I said, okay, so what? So if anything else of yours, Charles, was found at that crime scene, fingerprints, DNA, anything else, your property, would that mean that you were there? Yeah, and if you were there, would that mean that you were the person who committed this crime? And he goes, well, that would be obvious. And yeah, it would be obvious. What he didn't know or had forgotten or whatever, but which we knew about and which we were demanding be tested, was that there were additional prints found on the Bronco itself, unidentified prints. And it was a left palm print on the passenger door jamb where a person who was shooting those defenseless kids in the back seat would have stabilized himself and reached in and shot Jill and shot Brad. 4 days after I speak with Bonet, there comes back a match on that palm print. It's Charles Darnell Bonet. His palm print is at the scene, so now we've got his DNA, we've got his property, we've got his palm print, we've got his signature crime, for the love of God. This is a guy that was sexually aroused over his shoes. I mean, it all matches. It's there. It's nuts. If any cop in America would have all that evidence against any suspect, they would be doing backflips.
Now, just so I understand the palm print, when was it discovered?
Okay.
Was it in the original? Going over to 3 or 4 days after when they were in the 19 people were through the house, and my mind tells me that he's so in and out of prison. If it's a good print, in other words, well, it's only 8. It's only if it's you got all the whatever.
Right.
It has to be found instantly in 2000 whatever. Going through the various things.
Right.
So tell me again when it appeared. Was it before the first trial, even during investigation? Was it tested then? How did you get, or when was it tested or connected, and why so late?
It was discovered and lifted during the original investigation. And kudos to the state police for that. That's one thing that they did and did well. It was explained away by Stan Faith as much ado about nothing. Anybody could have touched that. It doesn't mean anything. And of course, the defense is saying, well, it can mean really critical stuff. It could mean that's the real perpetrator. But Bonet, now the second prosecutor, Henderson, he's got some issues here because there's so much evidence he cannot just tell Bonet to go on his way, and which, by the way, they had recommended that Bonet, according to Bonet, he even tells us that Henderson suggested that he talk to the press, and Bonet conducts all these, gives all these interviews to the media in Louisville about how he's been ramrodded because he's a ex-con and poor pitiful me. But so now Henderson, what do? So he finally had 6 Kessinger and Gilbert back on Bonet, and over the course of several hours, several days, they get a confession, and that is, yes, David Camm did it, and I only sold him a gun, and that was the gun that has never been recovered as the murder weapon. So that's what they go with. So they're saying that now that David Camm hired this guy or purchased a gun from this guy, but there's no indication of why this guy needs to show up at the crime scene. But it's just, and this is what they feed the press, because keep in mind, they're keeping a tight leash on the evidence, or at least on the facts. So it takes us several months to finally get Bonet's interviews and interrogations. I use that term interrogation very loosely because it's like, here, tell us how David Camm did it. So now this is what we have. They're saying that Bonet did it. What did he do? Well, he sold a gun. Well, why is he at the crime scene? Well, he sold him a gun. And now we find out that Bonet says, oh my gosh, I was at the crime scene, but only to sell David a second gun. No, well, why did you sell him a second gun? Why does he need that? Well, I go to his house, I follow him up there, and when I get there, he says he's going to get some money to pay me. In the meantime, this black Bronco rose up, and I see Camm, and she waves at me, and I'm just standing out there minding my own business. She pulls in the garage, and then the next thing I know, I hear 3 shots, and David Camm comes out of the garage and points a gun at me and says, you did this, and tries to shoot and kill me, but the gun misfires. And so David Camm turns around, runs back into the garage, and I run in after him. Well, if he tried to kill you, why would you run after a guy? Wouldn't you run away? So I run in there, and I stumble, and it's Camm on the garage floor, and not thinking, I pick up her shoes and put them on top of the car. Now, any cop after maybe a day in the street would say, geez, we're going to put this on Looney Tunes because this makes no makes no sense whatsoever. Makes no sense whatsoever. But that's what they go with. And that's what we've got. And so now, of all things, we're going for a second trial in Warwick County, right on the banks of the Ohio, downriver from Floyd County. And the two have been separated. Henderson had tried to try them both together, but it can't do it. So he tries Bonet in Floyd County and David Camm in Warwick County simultaneously, which, give him credit, was the smart thing to do because he knows he's going to convict Bonet with all the evidence against him. And so he does convict him within a period of a couple weeks, and David's trial is still ongoing.
You now have got these 2 trials going. Now, obviously, I'm guessing sort of the a theory of the crime with Bonet is he's an accessory by bringing the gun.
Right.
And they're still sticking with David was the shooter.
So now, in leading up to the second trials, you have one, Charles Bonet, being tried in Floyd County. And this begins in January 2006, as does Dave's trial, begins in Warwick County, same time. Dave's trial is going to be so much longer, and indeed it does turn out to be 9 weeks. Bonet's trial is 2 weeks, pretty simple. His own words, hang himself as much as anything. The jury doesn't buy the fact that all that he did was provide a gun. And Henderson, in so many words, says, hey, you can fill in the gaps here and determine to what extent these two conspired with one another, because both of them have been charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Bonet is convicted of the 3 murders, convicted of conspiracy, and convicted of being a habitual criminal. He gets tallied up 225 years. David, down the river in Warwick County, same-o. This trial, though, they can't mention any affairs or any women. But strangely enough, even after the Court of Appeals tells any future judge, be careful on what you allow when it comes to allegations of molestation, what happens is that Jill's external genitalia injury is brought in because it's part of the autopsy. And then, amazingly enough, the judge, Aylesworth, he allows Henderson to then make this quantum leap that it's not only molestation, but that Dave was a person who molested. And there's absolutely not one shred of evidence whatsoever that Dave harmed his child in any way, in any manner. On the contrary, it was everybody said he loved his kids, and he was instrumental in their activities, their lives. But yet, and I'm sitting at the defense table with Kitty and Stacy when Henderson comes over there, and there's Dave sitting next to us, and Henderson's pointing his finger. You, David Camm. This man's a molester. Jury, he's a molester. He molested his daughter. Dave had no chance whatsoever. And once again, emotion, prejudice overwhelms common sense. And later on, the jury is saying, well, how did you reconcile the fact that Sam and all these other people said he was with them at the time? They said, well, they were just wrong, or they were covering, and he snuck out sometime or some manner because it wasn't that far and he could have been there and back in 15 or 20 minutes. Ooh. And come back and playing basketball after he slaughtered his family and acted normal. Oh yeah, that's certainly possible. It's the one juror also said, well, we were convinced that there must have been two guns involved, and yet there was, because of the rules of evidence, we cannot bring that up about Boney's statements. They're being tried separately. So what happens is that there's no introduction to the jury, to the Camm jury, about a second gun. But yet the jury says they talked about a second gun. There's no way that happened unless someone was following Charles Bonet's trial when a second gun was discussed. So I'm convinced that the second Camm jury tainted themselves and, contrary to the judge's instructions, educated themselves on Bonet's ongoings.
And this, again, the craziness of the two trials, they were not allowed the second trial, only bring in, now maybe even they found in the papers and that bring in, they're trying to be good jurors. They knew nothing, like I said, what Bonet had said in interviews, or did they know any time during the trial that he'd been convicted?
Well, I'm convinced they did, but not because of any evidence that was introduced on by us, okay? And I can address that we can, and certainly part of Dave's defense in the second trial was that Charles Bonet obviously committed these crimes, and much of his the evidence against him was presented, and we could present his statements to the police, as I say, because of evidentiary issues, rules. But they certainly knew of all the evidence, or at least that tied Bonet to the murders of Kim, Brad, and Jill. But once again, here we have a very prejudicial issue, which never should have been brought up, but which was not only allowed but facilitated by the judge to be presented, and David Camm is found guilty.
Now, again, I have to just, so I'm clear.
Sure.
All the other evidence that came through that got you to you were going to use in a second trial, or that they realized they had to bring Bonet as part of it. So in the second trial, the stuff about the T-shirt, the sweatshirt,
Right.
And the DNA, and I know we don't have to cover it now, we can mention in passing the Marla or Mara or whatever her name was, and she was on there. So we know it was a sweatshirt that belonged to someone else, and then it was
Right.
clearly his. How was that explained by the prosecution in the second trial
Okay,
when they're
sure.
they're just trying to get the noose around Dave's neck?
Right. Okay.
I guess I'm just going to guess they're willing to accept because it's the same thing, whether you're accessory or you do it, you get the same
Right.
punishment.
Yeah.
So they're going to give up Bonet. They don't care, but they're still saying Bonet didn't do it on his own.
Right.
And if that's what it is, yeah, let's make it. This is the only place, because then the third trial's clean. But this, with the two trials, we've now prosecution has now accepted that Bonet is at least partially responsible as an accessory. Right. They know in their heads he did the whole thing.
Yeah, and as far as Dave's second trial, the prosecution still has to overcome the fact that he was playing basketball with these other people. So they address that by calling the basketball players themselves as witnesses, and in that regard, they bring them all in, and the assistant prosecutor, chief deputy Steve Owen, who's now a judge in Indiana, he asked the basketball players, well, so you were guarding David Camm. That's right. How many points did he score in the second game? I don't know. Well, you were there. Who was guarding him in the third game? I don't know. Who was the best player? How many points did he score? Exactly what time did you break for a water break? And of course, these guys don't know, but yet they're painted as confused. But they all say, "Hey, David Camm was there. I never saw him leave. I never saw him return. He was there." So but yet they do their best to muddy up these basketball players, and of course, their chief forensic guy is now Rodney Engler, who's taken the place of Rob Stites. Stites testifies, but Engler comes in, and he not only says that these 8 tiny dots are blowback, and by the way, they're from Jill, not from Kim, as Stites originally thought. So he says, these 8 tiny dots are high velocity impact spray. I recognize it because I'm the best. And that also I'm a crime scene reconstructionist, and David had to have been sitting in front of Jill, crouched down, shooting her in the head when this happened. Does that make any sense? Well, it didn't make any sense to me, but that's how they get the blood on the lower left portion of his shirt. And of course, he comes across as a guy that's, he worked on the O.J. Simpson case, worked on the Robert Blake case, and he's had all this extensive experience in all these major cases and has gone to Scotland Yard. And the answer is he's viewed as this expert, which I don't believe that he is, far from it. But so they've got the forensic guy now, and they've got, they're mitigating the basketball players, still saying that David had snuck out of the games, that it was possible that he did all this stuff. And then they, of course, they bring out the injuries to Jill, and they bring out the injuries to Kim. By the way, David never had a scratch on him. Kim had 22 cuts and bruises. Dave had nothing. And of course, the defense, we bring all this out, and we bring out all this evidence against Charles Bonet. We can't bring out his statements because of evidentiary rules, but we do bring out the fact that, hey, his property, this gray sweatshirt, we bring out the fact that his DNA's on it. And lo and behold, we also determined prior to the trial that the unknown female DNA, which had been discovered years before, turns out to be the girlfriend of Charles Bonet at the time of the murders, a woman by the name of Mala Singh. Mala Singh, how do you explain your DNA, which is apparently blood, on the sweatshirt? We find out from her interview by the Fresh Eyes that, did you ever wear your boyfriend's sweatshirt, maybe to bed? Oh, yes, maybe I did. Maybe I did do that. I'm sure I did. Did you ever get blood on it? See, how could I get blood on it? Oh, yeah, maybe it was during my time of the month, and that's how my blood got on there. It's like, well, why don't you just give her a script to follow? Oh, you did. So now that's how they explain that away. Mala Singh comes in and testifies, and she's about as believable as just horrific. But the jury essentially just cast her aside because it doesn't follow with the theory of the case as presented by Henderson. And it's clear that the jury is really aligned with the prosecution throughout this trial. The rulings by the judge in this second trial almost all heavily favor the prosecution. We try to get introduced my clip of Bonet where he says it would be obvious that he was the perpetrator if any of his fingerprints were found at the crime scene. The judge looks at that, he says, let me look at it again, and he goes, denied. And so it's like, well, that's pretty critical, but he denies it because he could, I guess. So here we are again in this second trial. We've got all this evidence, and you've got the evidence from Jill's injuries, in addition to the gunshot wound through the head, the external genitalia wound, and the judge allows the prosecution to then claim that Jill has been molested and that David was a molester.
I want people to realize, if they're not already, how crazy this is.
Yeah.
The first trial was overturned ostensibly because this claim that this was a motive, and we all know in trials you don't even need a motive.
Well, no, not really. There's a nuance here, Jim.
Okay.
The first trial, they absolutely said you cannot make any claim of motive based upon affairs because that is extremely prejudicial. They also said if you make a claim of molestation, you have to have clear and convincing evidence that it was her father who did it. You just can't say.
But they didn't. But they didn't.
Yeah, but they assumed apparently that a second prosecutor, if he's going to make this allegation, would have the evidence to back it up. It's nutty, but the second judge says, yeah, they can make whatever claim they want to, and we're beside ourselves. But there's no evidence. There's no evidence. How can you even go there? And I can emphasize that, and I will, but because it's just nutty. It's beyond fucking nuts. It is. But that's what I say. It's the judges they had their thumb heavily on the scales for the prosecution, and so here we are wrapping up the second trial, and we're just the frustration on the part of the defense and Dave is just nuts because we're saying we're not being given a fair chance to present the evidence, and not only that, but the evidence that's being presented is not accurate, and especially so by what Henderson is allowed to do during final arguments. And throughout this trial, we certainly know that the jury was told of Jill's genitalia injury. There was never any evidence presented whatsoever at any time by anyone that that injury, whatever it was, whoever committed it, and I think I know who committed it, I'm quite positive I know, was ever committed by her father. So prior to closing arguments, Kitty and Stacy tell the judge, hey, remember what the appellate court said, unless there's evidence linking this injury, purported molestation, to Dave, this cannot be argued. It cannot be brought before the jury. The judge incredibly says, I can't tell the prosecution what they can and cannot argue. It's like, the hell you can't. Judges do it all the time. What do you mean you can't tell them? But he allows Henderson in the final argument to get up and to say that that injury, you know, the one we showed you, that was committed by this man right here. This man, David Camm, and he walks over to our table and points at David Camm and says, he molested his daughter. It just, there was absolutely no way that David Camm was not going to be convicted again. And he was. He is convicted of the 3 murders. And this time around, he gets 3 life without paroles. So he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. It's more than irony that Bonet is convicted of conspiracy with David when it never happened. So it was Bonet falsely convicted of conspiracy? Yeah, he was. So now here's what we've got. We've got David convicted again. Kitty and Stacy are going to file the appeal, and they do in 2007, 2008. Finally, the Indiana Supreme Court, they hear it because it's a life without parole sentence, and they overturn this. Yet again, it's a second reversal by a 4-1 vote. The sole vote to sustain the conviction is by the Chief Justice, Randy Shepard, in Indiana. And I'm reading the decision. He sounds like a petulant child, where he's claiming, well, no one guaranteed that he was going to get a perfect trial. Well, geez, how about a fair one there, Chief Justice? You know, wouldn't that be nice? So as it turns out, the Chief Justice is incredibly good friends with, at least from the legal standpoint, with Keith Henderson. And it was a Chief Justice who had appointed Henderson to a committee on a very, I guess, what's the term on what? It was a Chief Justice who appointed Henderson to committee, which advised the Supreme Court on potential or prospective changes from a prosecutor's standpoint. So he clearly thought a lot of Henderson. So now we have the 4-1 verdict. Henderson says, well, I want the entire Supreme Court to look at this again and review it again. Amazingly enough, one of the justices changed his vote, and now it's 3-2. So David was within 1 vote of spending the rest of his life in prison.
Now, what was their, in other words, we know what the decision is, 3-2 reversal. Obviously, there's an opinion, and we're used to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court justice was dissenting. He got to write his dissent opinion.
Right.
So what did they use 5 or 6 different reasons why they're throwing it back, or did they focus maybe on one? What was?
Oh no, reason? It was yeah. As one would hope, the primary reason for the reversal was the fact that the allegation of molestation was just so heinous that it tainted the jury. You cannot make this up. The foreman of the jury said, "Well, that's not true. We didn't consider that," and subsequent to this reversal. But yet, shortly after the conviction, he said, "Oh yeah, that was important to our discussions." It's like, do you understand that you're contradicting yourself? But nonetheless, so now we've got a third trial coming up. Henderson's going to retry it again. But wait, there's yet another twist. Yeah, so now we have, Dave, here in 2009, a third trial pending. But still, Henderson is involved in the case. We know that he's withheld information. We know that, in my viewpoint, he's cheated time and time again with facilitation of judges. So what do we have here? We've got this third trial. But wait a minute. There's yet another, I'm not even sure it's a shoe, it's a boot that's going to be dropped. And this is that Henderson has hidden from everyone, including his chief deputy, the fact that he is writing a book about this case, which is in clear violation of the ethical canons for prosecutors who are still involved in the case. It clearly says you cannot engage in any literary contract or whatever. But yet, Keith Henderson is doing this. Keith Henderson, the chairman of the Ethics Committee of the Indiana Prosecuting Attorney Council, is engaged in writing a book in clear violation of the canonical ethics. You cannot make this stuff up. So now we're litigating this. And at this time, we have a new attorney, Rick Camm, involved with Stacy. And so we make the decision's made that we're going to fight this. We need to get Henderson off this case because there's no way that he is going to be ethical. He's already proven that he's unethical. And so we're not going to trust him. So this takes yet another 2 years, where David is languishing in not only Indiana State Prison, Wabash Valley. He gets assigned over there, supposedly, by the interdiction and the request of the prosecutor's office, and gets assigned to the secure housing unit, which is solitary confinement. There's no way that he was a model prisoner, but yet this is how they react. And then he finally gets transferred to Pendleton Correctional Facility in Pendleton, Indiana. But anyway, so now we've got this, and so what happens is that this is litigated, and a new prosecutor is finally, Henderson's tossed. He's tossed off the case. It's costing the citizens of Floyd County another $300,000 to get rid of Henderson and to get a new prosecutor. But that's okay because they've already spent about $5 million on this case prosecuting an innocent man. So now they got Stan Lefkoe, a career prosecutor from Vanderburgh County, Evansville, Indiana, and you got a new state police detective, Roger Drew, out of the Seymour Post. Roger, interestingly enough, was in the same recruit training class as was David in 1989. So they knew one another. Roger Drew is about the same level as Clemens and Gilbert, in my opinion, because he is one that cannot consider the remote possibility that David might be innocent. He even asked me if I was, quote unquote, still drinking the Kool-Aid, thinking that David was innocent. And I told him, obviously, that I was still a firm believer in Dave's innocence. But anyway, so we finally go through all these discovery, the depositions again, and it comes to August of 2013. And we've got a new trial in Boone County, Indiana, Lebanon, just northwest of Indianapolis. The judge is a guy by the name of John Dart, who's from southern Indiana, who, in my opinion, also puts his thumb on the scales for the state, for the prosecution, and I will tell you about that in a moment. But we have a jury that is not being told about affairs, not being told of a allegation that Dave had molested his daughter, and that the prosecution has to, strangely enough, more or less, stick to the facts, which they do. Yeah, that's an aha moment. We finally, not because of any ruling by the judge, but because of a statement by Rick Camm. And nowhere during this time, certainly in the first trial, they didn't know about Bonet. Second trial, we couldn't bring out the fact that Bonet's shoe fetish, attacking 5 women at night, stealing their shoes, getting sexually off on shoes. We couldn't do that in the second trial. Third trial, we can't do that either. But Rick did it. God bless him. And in opening arguments, Rick says, and you're going to hear about how Charles Bonet, and I'm paraphrasing, Charles Bonet, these shoes were on top of the car, and Charles Bonet was the guy that put him there because of his shoe fetish. Well, the court erupts. The judge is aghast. He threatens to sanction Rick. I'm applauding in my mind, as were several others, because finally a jury hears what they need to hear. And why they couldn't hear this, there was no logical reason other than the fact that it would hurt the state's case, because the real perpetrator would be unmasked. But so what we have in this third trial, we bring in the basketball players again. Dave's uncle Sam, God, what a great guy. A great deal of integrity and character. He testifies, as do the others. The jury's convinced these people are telling the truth because they're telling the truth. But we also have the prosecution's star witness. And who do you think that might be? That would be Charles Darnell Bonet. So he is brought to the courthouse on 2 days in the company of the state police's emergency response team, shackled in his orange uniform, and he is treating this like the star that he thinks he is. And it's you think, can this guy not be any more shameless? And the answer is, that's who he is. And I should also say, and I failed to mention this, but I spoke with a couple of his girlfriends / wives. Charles Bonet also had a higher power. Charles Bonet had written an autobiography about himself. His higher power is the devil. As one girlfriend said, he would wake up at midnight, light black candles, and chant to the devil. And his autobiography, the handwritten cover page, Charles Bonnet, and it had a little devil with horns and a trident. Normally, most people would view that as a clue. I did, the state police didn't. But nonetheless, he got this guy who comes in, and over a period of 2 days, he tells the jury about what a victim he's been at the hands of David Camm, and that he was just manipulated into selling David these guns. He happened to meet David by chance in front of the butcher shop that was owned by Kim's sister and brother-in-law, and that's where they happened to meet. And that's where he said he was going to meet him again. Well, how did you guys come up with this? Did you call one another? I can't remember how we were going to do that, but we did something, and nonetheless, we met there. So once again, it made no sense. But Bonnet says that, okay, I sold him these two guns, and by the way, I was manipulated, but not seen by the defense, but seen by the at least 2 or 3 people in the jury who were sitting directly in front of the witness box, was the fact that Bonnet, whose hands were shackled to this belt around his waist, his hands were below the table, and as he was describing what he saw at the crime scene, that he heard David shoot and kill his family, Bonnet is pointing his hands, fingers, index fingers, like a gun, and he's going, one, mouthing at David. It's mocking him that he shot and killed his family. Bonnet could not let the occasion pass without telling David, I shot and killed your family, and there's not a thing you can do about it. It's about as heartless as one could be. Of course, Bonnet, thinking that he's a smart guy, executing 2 kids in the backseat of a car. The fact that he is the worst coward that I've ever met in my life, and I've met a bunch of them in my career, but Charles Bonnet was the most gutless coward I've ever met in my life. And his claim to fame was that he murdered 2 defenseless kids, and he, at 300 pounds and a prison weightlifter, had managed to manhandle and shoot a woman who weighed less than half of him in the head. That is his claim to fame. But after his 2 days of testimony, the jury was disgusted. I interviewed 6 of them at length. They were disgusted by him. They were disgusted by the fact that the prosecutor called him as a witness. When they saw Rod Englert explain how the blood got on David's shirt, the jury was also disgusted by Rodney Englert when they saw his explanation of how the blood got on David's shirt. They viewed him as a charlatan, as I do. They discounted practically every aspect of the state police and the prosecution's case. And as one told me, I always thought that the state police were the good guys. They were not.
Now,
Pretty sad.
just a question. Now that it was clear you did it in that there was a prosecution. What was your idea or your feeling of why? It sounds like you're throwing the case to bring this idiot in. He's not going to move your case forward. They're going to believe him saying that I didn't do it. I'm going to jail for the rest of my life, but I was in cahoots with this upstanding, wonderful man who plays basketball in the church. It almost sounds like he's throwing it, but I guess he thought that this was worth something.
Jim, that's an excellent point, and I'll address that. Uh, Before, during, and after Bonet's testimony, we were thinking, first of all, we were hoping that they would call him as a witness because we knew that the psychopath would paint himself as a victim and would come across, we thought, to the jury as a person who was despicable. And you think, well, if we believe that, why in the world would the prosecution and the state police agree that he should be called? And I can only tell you that apparently they thought he was going to bring something to the case and bring the connection between Dave and him to the case, and the fact that the jury would conclude that he had already been convicted, and indeed he had been convicted. That was brought out to them, so that he was doing this because he wanted to see justice done or something. But clearly his when asked about all these specifics, he either denigrated him. He jokingly referred to himself previously as a Pinocchio, the guy that had lied to the state police, but now he's telling the truth. So you lied here, here, and here, and then these other 24 times, and now you're telling the truth. Yeah, that's right. You shake your head and think, God, why did they call him? I'm just glad they did, because the jury was clearly convinced that he was despicable, and they were clearly upset with the prosecution for calling such a despicable person. But so now we're thinking we've got this case, and it's won. Another shoe to drop, because the judge, final instructions. The judge says, and this is after, keep in mind after, the second judge had issued a directed acquittal on the conspiracy. This judge says, well, I'm going to tell the jury they can convict David of aiding and abetting Charles Bonet in the commission of these murders. And well, wait a minute, time out, Judge. There's absolutely no evidence of this whatsoever. And you can't do that. This is just manufacturing out of whole cloth of something which was never presented. It's not, doesn't make any sense. And he goes, no, he says, I'm going to do that. And so that's what the prosecution did, saying, hey, we told you, and I'm paraphrasing, we've told you throughout this, again, an 8-9 week trial, that we believe that David Camm shot and killed his wife and kids. But you know what? You don't have to believe that. If you believe that all he did was tell Bonet to go there and shoot and kill his kids while he was playing basketball, that's okay too. You can convict him on that. It's like, my God, will you people ever stop? So the prosecutor does say that, which I guess in one sense it's good, because he's saying, we've got a horrific case against David, but if you can think that there might be something there. So the jury goes out that day, and they're gone there that night. We bring them back the next morning, and within a short period of time, 3 hours, they've reached a verdict. And this verdict is acquittal on all three. Never will forget that. That was 13 years. 13 years it took for David to finally get justice, and for his family to finally get justice. And it was so unneeded. And it was all because no one in any position of authority, not in the state police, not in a prosecutor's office, not anywhere, did anyone say, time out, this is wrong. We need to stop. This doesn't make any sense. Let's come to our senses. No one had the courage. And no one to this day still has the courage, even though David pursued civil litigation. And I was very pleased to have helped him and his attorney in that. And quite frankly, 7 years after the fact, he finally gets compensation, but only after the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in a civil case issued a ruling on what was to be what their decision had been. And I really need to mention this. There's a 3-judge panel in the Seventh Circuit out of Chicago, including at that time Judge Amy Coney Barrett, who's a Supreme Court justice now. Here's their conclusion, and they just really ripped to shreds the initial probable cause affidavit. But they say there is a wealth of evidence, and I'm quoting, a wealth of evidence here that Stites, Englert, Faith, and Clemens contributed false statements and withheld crucial information, either intentionally or with reckless disregard for the truth. That's sad, and that's horrific, and that's what happened. Finally, 2 years later, David did settle with Floyd County. He'd done that previously, but with the state of Indiana, primarily the state police, and his settlements were over $5 million, and that's not what he settled with Stites and Englert, and I don't know the amount there. That was not published, but whatever amount he got, there's no way that it would be sufficient to cover what he went through. But that's what it did. It took 21 years for him to at least get some degree of compensation, and it was also unneeded. Pride, Jim, is a hell of a motivation for people. And you're asking me, you're telling me that people actually might have believed that David was innocent, but their pride prevented them from doing the right thing. And that's exactly what I'm saying in my assessment. They couldn't admit that they were wrong.
Was there ever a time you had one and you had two and you had three? You must have had coffees and all sorts of stuff, if not with Dave, because again, he was not bailed at any time, where you just said, I can't do this anymore. I mean, I can't go through. You guys could. You're out there with your families. Yeah. Did he at one point just say, especially like after the second one, probably after the second one was appealed and reversed, when you walked into the third, how much drugs did you give him?
Yeah, that's a good question. He knew that he was convicted based upon all the bullshit. He knew that. And he knew that he was confident of getting another trial after the first and second convictions. That doesn't equate to the fact that he had been down, and I'd seen him down. But, you try and pump him up, and occasionally I would visit with him in the joint. I would write him occasional letters. But keeping him involved in the defense was Kitty and Stacy and Rick had all done that, and that was important. One thing I didn't talk about were the three jailhouse informants. And it's interesting that in the first trial, there were no witnesses on behalf of the prosecution who were either cellmates or incarcerated with David. But lo and behold, prior to the second trial, they start coming out of the woodwork. And believe me, that's not just a euphemism, because these cockroaches did crawl out. Three specific informants. They would have used more, but these other would-be witnesses, they got things so wrong about the case. But three they did use, at least in the second trial, including one guy who at age 16 had murdered his drug supplier in a premeditated murder. And he had claimed that David had confessed to him about killing his wife and kids. This guy said that David was upset because his wife was going to divorce him, and she would get all of this family goods and wealth. The only problem with that is that David was the one making less money, didn't have as much as Camm. Camm's job was much better than David. David, I mean, a spouse is not going to kill the other spouse for money if the other spouse is making a lot more money, and Camm was. So that didn't make any sense. The other would-be informant is a guy, very despicable guy by the name of James B. Hatton. He said that David told him that he had murdered his family and that he had done so outside the garage and had disarranged the blood outside the garage so to make it confusing or whatever. And it's like, well, that doesn't even make any sense. But they used him. Because, among other things, this told the jury, the second jury, that David had been incarcerated. And that was a way to get before the jury that he was incarcerated with all these really bad, slimy guys. And so Dave must also be a really bad, slimy guy. And then the other informant was a guy who was a suspect in a really horrific crime, 1978, in the murders of four young people at a fast food restaurant in Indianapolis. As a matter of fact, had given information of a very detailed specifics about this crime. And he had also been incarcerated because, among other things, he had abducted and raped a woman. But yet this guy is claiming that Dave had confessed to him, and all three very despicable people. There's no corroboration. On the contrary, the information they provided wasn't consistent with the known facts, forensic facts, but yet they used them. And that's yet another aspect of the prosecution's cases.
Now, what, just out of my curiosity, what did Dave do? What was his occupation after being a policeman,
Well, he went to work for his uncle in the foundation repair and stabilization business, and they were getting ready to launch their gutter guards at the time, which got a great profit margin, and that's when he was charged.
Yep.
So after he got released in 2013, he did go back to work and worked there for several years. Dave was very, very indebted to and appreciative of his uncle. Sadly, Sam's been dead for 3 years now, but what a great guy! Just turned out to be a great friend.
Now, I want to point out to the audience as we wrap up here that there is a website, and I've started looking at this. I want to point out, you pointed it out to me in our email exchanges, that there's video of this interview. I think the video is just on Bonet, not on you, but you hear your voice.
Yes.
I only looked at one of them, but it's your interviews that he allowed you to get. He said, sure, I'll do them. So it really gives you a good idea of him. And there are pictures in the book also of other people in the case, and you can certainly Google and see the kids, and just I don't know what would be worse. Probably both, but certainly after 13 years. But you're sitting in prison. Is it worse that you're incarcerated, which is pretty bad, but also that everybody thinks you wiped out your family, and you didn't?
Yeah.
So you're innocent. Well, that comes with that's not getting you out of prison. There are people who, because of this, my crazy ones, and the Innocence Project gets involved, where because of a technicality and their witnesses or judges have come forward and said, yeah, you're innocent, but we can't overturn the jury's conviction.
Yeah.
Because there's no grounds for it, but it's very clear, yeah, you didn't do it. There's a couple of those cases. And with that, you just shoot yourself. You jump off the roof of the prison or whatever.
Yeah.
In his case, everyone, probably the press, like I said, people are still, he's a molester. We didn't go into that. And I will point, when I wrap this up for the air, I will point out, get the book, because there's all the information in there that we've, not skipped over, but condensed, that the press, especially just Bonet being out there, that I'm sure the public thought, he was a molester. And of course he killed his wife and 2 kids. That's what they do.
Yeah. That's, and that's a great point. And Dave, of course, he would get angry. He would get in people's faces. I didn't kill my wife and kids. I didn't molest my daughter. The answer is, yeah, everybody in prison's innocent.
So give my folks in your own voice there how they can find your book. Aside from online and at all the bookstores, but how can they go online to see these interviews of Bonet and get other information? It's quite well laid out. I'm not sure, is it a website or a Facebook page?
No, it's website.
And what's the address of the website, Barry?
The website is David Camm, The Reckoning. The website has several different parts, not the least of which is my interview, various clips with Charles Bonet, including the parts where he lies and where he's trying to be manipulative, and people can figure that out. But it also shows the first investigation, the various prosecutors and prosecutions, trials. Certainly it's not in depth. The book is very detailed, and certainly you can get that at Amazon or Barnes and Noble or Books A Million, which is interesting, Jim, because when I ask people now, do you think that David was involved? And there's still a lot of people who think that he was. And I said, well, tell me, what evidence do you think that there is that ties him into the crime? Well, I just know, or I've got a friend who's with the state police, and he tells me, or I've got a friend with whatever, and she knows all about this. Jim, okay. I appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
This was amazing. I can now get out of this hot room, and my wife probably wants to know where dinner is. But anyway, so I'm going to turn off the recording. So I'd like to thank you, folks, for kindly tuning in for another episode of Murder Most Foul. If you liked what you heard, I hope you'll tell your friends. Information about the podcast and an email link that can get a message to me can be found at the podcast's website, the address being www.murdermostfoul, all one word, no caps, no spaces, .com. So until we meet again, stay safe, and for God's sakes, don't murder anyone.